lightning fast downloading, super fast streaming and super fast online gaming. All at our lowest ever standard price for fibre. $24.99 a month on an 18-month contract with a one-off $9.99 delivery fee. But now with no activation fee when you join BT before May 10th. Super fast fibre for super fast everything. Search BT Broadband to join today.
Prices may change. New customers, 30 gigs usage, terms apply.
LBC travel on the North Circular Road still very slow in both directions to the Crooked Billet underpass because of the flooding. Delays of about 45 minutes on the M25 clockwise from junction 29 at the A127 over the QE2 bridge to junction 1B at Dartford, and that was after an accident, but all the lanes are now back open. Also on the M25 there are delays clockwise to junction 24 at Potters Bar. The barrier repair works are still taking place. Not looking good on the A10 southbound. There's a queue from Ware to Hoddesdon because of a fuel spillage. On the train, southeastern and southern services, they're disrupted because of the strong winds and heavy rain, and also because of the bad weather. Lots of delays and cancellations at London City Airport. LBC Travel, I'm Joanne Webb.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Ring Rees-Mogg. Put your calls to Jacob Rees-Mogg now. 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
Good morning, 4 minutes after 9 on Monday, April the 30th. I'm Nick Ferrari here to present Ring Rees-Mogg with Conservative MP for North East Somerset, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's in the studio with me. And it's almost as much a part of a feature of British life as that it rains on bank holidays, as when any prominent job becomes available, we always look to Jacob Rees-Mogg and suggest his name for it. So a couple of possibilities since I last saw you, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Can I link you with the role of the Arsenal manager or the Home Secretary?
I think both are equally unlikely.
Why is that? You have no interest in either.
I wouldn't be competent to be the Arsenal manager, and I'm not going to be asked to be Home Secretary. It's a very important post to fill, and the Prime Minister has a lot of good and able people she can choose from, but there are issues relating to the Brexit balance and so on that she will need to bear in mind as to who she appoints. And you never know, she may go for somebody like Nicky Morgan to try and maintain the balance within the party.
That's interesting you mentioned that name. Let's get straight to the calls. I have the benefit of more time with you, but the idea is that you ring Rees-Mogg. Jacob Rees-Mogg, such a prominent Conservative, not least in the conversation about these troubling Brexit times and the negotiations, Michel Barnier indeed arriving in Ireland. And the first call, I think, pertains to that conversation we just started on, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Marina's in Kensington. You're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Goes ahead, Marina. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick.
Hello.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg. I'd like to ask, because I believe that, first of all, it's not nice to gloat on anyone's misfortune, and it's good that Amber Rudd finally saw the light and did resign. But do you think she was the human shield for Theresa May? Because I believe Theresa May should be resigning.
No, Marine, I don't think that she's the human shield for Theresa May. I think it's a great shame that Amber Rudd has resigned. She is an extremely capable, able person running a very difficult department. I think she's behaved very honourably in resigning in the best traditions of ministerial responsibility. But any Home Secretary runs a vast department, and inevitably there will be parts of what's going on in the department that the Home Secretary is not fully briefed about. So I think Amber Rudd has behaved well, but that it's not Mrs May's responsibility. She stopped being Home Secretary 2 years ago.
Marina?
Well, the thing is, wasn't it Mrs May that brought in, she was Home Secretary for 10 years, number one. She knew very well what was going on in light of this Windrush situation. And also, wasn't she the one that brought in the policy, was it the...
I think you mean, well, let me help you, Marina. Do you mean the go-home vans, as they're called? The trucks?
Yes, but there was a hostile...
The hostile environment.
What's called the hostile environment. Yep. Yeah. Marina, don't go. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
The hostile environment actually predates Mrs May. I did a programme with Channel 4 News last week, and it was very interesting. I met a lady representing her brother who had got a letter questioning his status in 2009. This is a deep-seated problem. This doesn't make it excusable. It's a terrible problem. And what's happened to the Windrush people, Commonwealth people, not just from the Caribbean, also I had a constituent from Australia who was affected by this, has been a terrible, terrible problem, and it does raise questions about the hostile environment issue. The point of the hostile environment was to make it difficult for illegal immigrants, not for legal ones, and it was very badly applied. But that predates Mrs May even, and certainly predates Amber Rudd.
How big a mistake were those go-home trucks or go-home vans, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
I think those go-home trucks had very little support from anybody. They were a lapse of good taste.
And you said once with me 2 weeks ago that as a result of the Windrush shambles affair, whatever you want to call it, that you didn't think the Home Office was functioning particularly well, and it had always been like that. Well, Amber Rudd, of whom you speak so warmly, she had been there for nearly 2 years, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Shouldn't you have tidied some of this up?
I think she was making very good progress. The Home Office has a great deal to do, and Amber Rudd managed to lead the Home Office through a difficult period with terrorism attacks, to be a leader in that department, to try and ensure that we're kept safe day in, day out. But the Home Office does so many things, and of course, as Home Secretary, you're held responsible, and quite rightly, this is how our system works, when it goes wrong for one person once. And within the range of responsibilities of the Home Office, that is a very difficult brief to have.
Quick response from you, Marina, before I move on. Do you have a final observation?
Okay. Well, Mr. Mogg is right. Some Australian people also were affected by this issue, but it was predominantly the black-skinned Caribbean people that were affected. And Mr. Mogg, one last thing. Wouldn't you best be served in going into the immigrations, because you're very good at scrutinising policies, and maybe you can find the failings of your government that are currently going on and be honest to us about it.
There we are. That's taken to the streets to ensure that you do go into government, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Well, Marina, you make a really interesting point. The great Teddy Roosevelt, when he was holding various public offices, including one in charge of the police in New York, would go around New York in the middle of the night and find police sitting in bars and things, and would say, "Get back to work." And one of them turned around to him and said, "Who do you think you are, Teddy Roosevelt?" Which he replied, "Yes, I am, and get back to work." I think there's a lot to be said for this type of direct approach.
Which you could bring.
Well, I wouldn't have the authority to as a backbench MP, but I'd love to.
No, but what Marina is suggesting that if you went in, you're the sort of person who would do the Roosevelt approach.
Well, I think Boris does the Roosevelt approach. I think he did as mayor, and I think it's got a lot to commend it.
But what about you going into some form of that in government?
Well, it's not in my hands. I'm on the Brexit select committee.
Yes, you are. Very influential.
Supervising the government, or scrutinising the government in its Brexit policy.
I prefer the word supervising.
Supervising was a misspeak.
You're pretty good with words, Mr. Rees-Mogg. I wonder if that slipped out. Marina, thank you. Matthew in Heathrow, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, hi, Jacob.
Morning, Matthew.
I wanted to ask basically, what is your position on the immigration target?
Can we have targets in immigration? Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I think you can have targets in immigration, but targets shouldn't override the law. And so we need to look at separate things. We need to look at the total number of people who come into this country each year. It is reasonable to have a target for that. We can look at the target for deporting illegal immigrants, and that probably should be a percentage target rather than a numerical target, because if you've got a very small number of illegal immigrants, having a target may mean you're approaching people who aren't illegal. If, on the other hand, you have a percentage target, you know you're focusing on the right problem. But it's really important that people who are legitimately and legally here are not harassed. And I think the problem with the hostile environment was that it was a type of show your papers culture, which is alien to the British way of life. And I don't like that, and I think it was a mistake.
Quick response from you, Matthew.
Yeah, but I mean, when is the point where a person becomes an illegal? I mean, if the system is set against people who are legally here, and they were trying to get their papers. I mean, the Home Office is just trying to profit on with the fees they're charging, and a lot of people can't achieve the goals what have been set out.
Isn't there a danger, even with percentages, you still, let's say you're talking about 20,000, you've still got 2,000 that you have to boot out?
I think you need a different starting point, actually. I think you need to register people coming in and going out. And then you know the people who have come in but haven't gone out. And that would not include people who came here in 1968, because they wouldn't be on the system of people who've come in recently who haven't left. And I think it's an overhaul of the whole system to ensure that the only people you're chasing are those who are here illegally. And I don't know, Matthew, whether you agree with that or whether you think it should be done differently.
In a sentence, Matthew, your response?
Well, yeah, I agree. There should be entry and exit checks to solve the immigration issues.
OK. Matthew, thank you. To a question that's related to this, I sense. Martin in Birmingham, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, Martin.
Good morning. My question is, what do you think about what Boris Johnson did say about amnesty, giving all the legal immigrants on amnesty? What do you think about that, Jacob?
These are people who've been here for 10 years. They'd have to be, I think the Foreign Secretary's words were squeaky clean, and they should be granted an amnesty. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I think an amnesty is difficult because of the unintended consequences. I think if you have one amnesty, people assume that you will have another amnesty, and that therefore it encourages more illegal migration in future. I think it tends to be arbitrary as well. What about the person who's been here for 9 years and 364 days, who then gets thrown out, but the person who's been here for 1 day longer stays? I think, however, there should be more discretion within the system.
How do you have that in practical terms?
How do you have that? Well, again, I met a lady, aged 28, who'd been in this country since she was 12, looking after her father, living with her father, who's legitimately here, who suddenly got a letter saying she was going to be removed in 14 days. Now, that cannot be a reasonable way to behave to people.
No.
And that's where I think you need discretion and wisdom rather than formulaic targets or formulaic amnesties to say, if you meet this particular criterion, you can stay, but if you don't, you've still got to go. I think you need, and Amber Rudd actually said this, you need a more humane system. And I think currently we have a very much tick box culture of immigration implementation. And it's hard to change that. But I think with ministerial direction it could be changed.
It's interesting you would use the word humane and Amber Rudd, because many would see Windrush as anything but humane, unless she's acting as the human shield for Theresa May.
No, the point she made in the House of Commons was that the Home Office had lost sight of the individual and was concentrating more on the system. And it is thought that this comment may have so annoyed officials in the Home Office that they then leaked documents that did her harm. I have no idea whether that's true, but there's been a lot of press speculation about that.
Just coming back to the idea of this amnesty, it is estimated, and obviously by its very nature we're never going to know how many people of whom we speak, but it could be up to 500,000 people. Wouldn't it be better to have them in the system, paying taxes and legitimised? Boris Johnson's supporters would argue.
I think the problem is you'd then have another 500,000 over the next 10 years, and then what do you do? Is it a 10-year rolling amnesty? Is it, if you get here and you can hide for 10 years, you will then get an amnesty every 10 years? Or is it just a one-off? And nobody will believe it's a one-off. And so I think you simply encourage long-term illegal immigration.
In an aspect of this, you may be aware, in fact I would hope you take the newspaper for obvious reasons, in the Times this morning there's a letter signed by Charles Clarke and Alan Johnson, both former Home Secretaries, saying the idea of ID cards is back on the agenda. Jacob Rees-Mogg, do you support the idea of an ID card?
No, I'm strongly against the idea of ID cards because they change the relationship between the individual and the state. We have a right to go about our business and not to be stopped by anybody to prove who we are or what we're doing.
Could have prevented Windrush, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
I don't think it could have prevented Windrush because when these people applied for ID cards, they wouldn't have been given them because the system wasn't working. It's very often something that is held up as a solution to problems that it wouldn't solve.
Well, it went out in 1952, and almost every other year there's a suggestion they should return.
Come back, and the reason they went out in 1952 was because it was for a wartime emergency, but it is not something that you have in ordinary circumstances because we are not answerable to the state as long as we're obeying the law. Once you have ID cards, at any point, a policeman is entitled to stop you to say, what are you doing, and prove who you are. And that is simply not the British approach. I think it's also worth saying that if we had proper entry and exit controls, you wouldn't need people who were here to prove who they were because you'd know who the illegal immigrants were.
You stress the word exit because I think when we enter it's fairly robust, or it has been whenever I've come through, but exit is perhaps a rather more fleeting affair.
That's
is that
absolutely
fair?
right, yes.
OK. Martin, thank you. Anthony and Staines, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen.
Morning, sir.
Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning, Mr. Mogg. I would like to ask you, do you agree with my proposition that this resignation brings Boris closer to number 10?
Well, I'm supporting Theresa May. I think it's very important to back her. I think it's crucial that she gets the work on Brexit done. But I've long been an admirer of Boris Johnson. He is a first-class and charismatic individual with a popular touch that other politicians look upon.
Well, this doesn't
with envy.
strengthen Mrs May's position as of 10 o'clock last night, does it?
It wouldn't have strengthened her position when Damien Green resigned, who was effectively her deputy. But a week or two goes by and the ship of state sails on and the Prime Minister remains Prime Minister.
You don't see this as a bit of a dent? Or it's not hold underwater, but at least a hole?
No. It's not a hole. It's not a hole. It's not a hole underwater. It is the part of the life of a politician that these sorts of events happen. And it happens to all politicians. And it happened to Tony Blair when he was at his strongest. He kept on losing Peter Mandelson and then bringing him back again. And even
6 Home Secretaries in 8 years under Labour, totally.
So there you go, that Home Secretaries are running a very difficult department. They often find that they are either moved voluntarily or involuntarily, and Prime Ministers carry on.
Let's ask you, Anthony, do you think it moves Boris Johnson closer to the threshold of number 10? Anthony?
Yes, I do, because he's won 2 elections, for one thing, in London. He's proved he can run London, and I think he's the only Tory who can actually hold the country.
All right. Anthony, thank you. Let's move to other questions about other Tories, actually. Dan in Leicester, you have a question about another Conservative MP. Good morning.
Good morning, chaps. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you, sir. Go ahead, your question.
Good. With Brexit's getting ever closer, and the range of views that are on show on the government benches is broader than it's ever been. Well, at one end of the spectrum, Mr. Rees-Mogg, and at the other end, somebody like Anna Soubry, who are almost caricatures of the Leave and Remain positions at the moment. And I wonder how the government expects to unite the country around a vision for Brexit while it's accommodating views as disparate as these.
And just to illustrate those views, Mr. Rees-Mogg, hold on the line, Dan, I'll return to you, Mr. Rees-Mogg, in a moment. Anna Soubry was on my show rather recently, and she had this to say, Mr. Rees-Mogg, about you.
Let us hope that Jacob becoming leader of the party is hypothetical.
What is the problem with Jacob Rees-Mogg?
I'm afraid he's not my view of a Conservative. And I find,
why not?
Because I think, a lot of it, I don't agree with him about crashing out without a deal. I find his views on abortion particularly distasteful, frankly. I mean, if a child...
They're informed by his faith, though, of course.
Doesn't matter.
Right.
He's entitled to a view. I don't have a problem with somebody having a view. What I have a problem with is when they impose that on the choice that should be made by a woman.
So coming back to Dan's central point, Mr. Rees-Mogg, this is the two sides of the Conservative Party. How can it all be one united happy band?
Oh, well, I actually hold Anna Soubry in the highest regard. She's an enormously capable and intelligent person, was a good minister when she held ministerial office. I disagree with her on the European issue, but I wouldn't question her commitment to the Conservative Party. And so I think the party can reunite. The vision for Brexit is, of course, key to that, but it's really interesting that opinion polling seems to show that the vast bulk of the country has accepted that we are going to leave and simply wants the government to get on with it. And that, I think, is very powerful because that gives something for us to reunite over.
Do you recognise what's being called a customs partnership?
The customs partnership is the customs union by any other name.
Therefore, it's not tenable.
It is not tenable, no. It's a deeply unsatisfactory scheme. The government will find it very difficult to make it work. The European Union doesn't like it. And it effectively means we're not only in the customs union, but in the single market. The customs partnership's a silly idea.
Dan, a quick response from what you've heard?
Yeah, it seems to me that both positions, Mr. Rees-Mogg and Ms. Soubry's positions, seem to be more about holding a position rather than addressing any of the problems that those positions entail. It just seems like trying to cast as broad a net as possible to accommodate whatever Brexit happens to you.
So, Dan, what do you want to happen? What are you calling for?
Well, I voted Remain, so I'm more in Ms. Soubry's end of the spectrum. But what I would like to see is a government proactively trying to deliver a Brexit rather than simply trying to accommodate one that happens to it, which seems that's the way it reads to me at the moment.
Well, I agree with you on that, and I think the difficulty is within the negotiations. We don't necessarily know all of the government's negotiating position. I hope it will become clearer come October when we know what the government has actually asked for and what it's got, and that will give greater clarity about the future progress.
Thank you for that. Let's Dan, thank you. Matthew in Penrith. Matthew, you're on the radio. What's your question? Good morning.
Hello, how are you doing?
Hello, Matthew.
My question is, do you think, Mr. Rees-Mogg, good morning, by the way.
Good morning, Matthew. Thank you for calling.
The Lords should be quoted and brought to heel, shall we say?
Well, that's an interesting question because today, you'll be aware, Mr. Rees-Mogg, there is a vote, I think, on a Liberal Democrat amendment requiring votes in the Lords and Commons on whether to hold a second referendum before Brexit is finalised after Labour last night saying it would resign. So there's goings on at the Lords yet again, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Yes, I think the Lords is putting itself in a very difficult constitutional position. It's decided to take up the banner of peers against the people, that it is doing its best with a series of amendments, and the one today is particularly important, to stop the referendum result coming into law. And the benefit of the House of Lords is as a revising chamber, one that looks as a piece of legislation and says that clause won't work, it hasn't been written properly, or asking the government to think again on an area where it doesn't have a manifesto behind it. In this bill, the government has behind it not only a referendum result, but also its commitment in the manifesto last year. And the Lords is ignoring that, and that is not the role of a revising chamber. And very few people have that much respect for the House of Lords. They don't think about it a lot of the time, but when it opposes the government, the democratically elected government, and tries to stop legislation as a house of appointed people, many of them getting pensions from the European Union, it does its own reputation a huge amount of damage.
So, no customs union, no single market, no customs partnership, which I think you find particularly loathsome. What is the future?
What is the future is a free trade deal. We want to have a deal similar to the one that Canada's got so that we can trade freely without tariffs with the European Union, and then we can do deals with the rest of the world too. Bear in mind, 60% of our trade goes to the rest of the world.
They being EU, do you think the EU would sign that, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
I think a Canada deal is relatively straightforward. It's the pluses on Canada that are being asked for that may make it harder, and the issues surrounding financial services. But in my view, financial services are so international that there's very little that the deal could give that the city really needs.
If you would allow that Mrs May has been pretty robust on leaving the customs union, do you think that is her true position? You don't see any change in that?
Oh, no, I don't. She put it in the manifesto. Leaving the customs union, the single market, were in the manifesto. And this is where the Lords is looking so foolish, because under the Salisbury-Addison Convention, the House of Lords does not oppose manifesto commitments. And it is saying, oh, well, the government didn't win the election, therefore manifesto commitments don't count. This is entirely specious. The government is the government, its manifesto commitments are its manifesto commitments.
But what about the Remainers in the Cabinet? Might some Remainers decide to go at some point?
Well, that's a matter for them. I don't think that they will, because they stood on the same manifesto. So every Conservative MP stood on a manifesto saying we will leave the customs union. Now, some MPs may have put out their own letters to voters saying that they didn't intend to do that, and that's a perfectly reasonable position to hold, and I expect Ken Clarke's voters knew that he was not going to do that. But the rest of us are bound in by what we said we would do in our manifesto last year.
Matthew, thank you for that question. Let's go to Bertie in Belfast. I sense we might know what the question's about. Bertie, good morning, sir. You're on the radio.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Jacob.
Good morning, Bertie.
How are we ever going to get a deal with Southern Ireland when their attitude is that even cameras on or near the border are infrastructure? I mean, all our streets are full of infrastructure with cameras everywhere. And basically, when Barnier and Subry and all talk about this, they must consider that there's lives at risk here, you know.
Stay on the line, Bertie. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I think the Irish government is using this for its own domestic political purposes, and the European Union is using it as a means to try and keep us within the single market and the customs union. There already is a border, as you know perfectly well, that there's an excise border for fuel and for tobacco and for drink. There is an immigration border, though there's a common travel area. Nonetheless, residency requirements for non-EU nationals either side of the border are different. So there already is a border. It's merely a question of how it is enforced and whether it needs to be enforced physically at the border or whether it can be enforced remotely. And the answer the British government's consistently come up with is that it can be enforced remotely, that any customs duties or any health and safety checks can be carried on
a 300-mile-plus border can be enforced in that fashion, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Well, as much as it can be enforced at all, you actually make the point completely correctly that because it's so long, you can't have customs men in peaked caps along every yard of it, and therefore you've got to accept that the bulk of the rules will have to be enforced remotely.
Will that be sold into the EU?
Well, it's the obvious thing to do, and I would call their bluff. I would say, OK, we're not putting up a border. Are you? And that would leave the challenge for the Irish government to decide whether it wished to put up a Trump-like wall between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. I doubt they want to do that. But I'd be interested in Bertie's view, because obviously he's calling from Belfast.
Bertie, talk to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Jacob, I agree with you totally. I mean, the border can be controlled by, which we already have a border, as you state, that can be controlled easily by cameras. The technology is advancing every day. I mean, we have a similar situation in Switzerland, Canada, America. But what the Southern Irish government are really playing with fire, because if the UK leaves the EU, we are a staunch ally of Southern Ireland, and they've been talking agents ago about alignment, which would mean everybody's corporation tax is going to have to go up. So Southern Ireland's going to be paying like 27% corporation tax. If we reduce ours, all the high-tech companies then will move north into Northern Ireland and into the UK.
That's an extremely good point. Alignment is not all that favourable. And I think we want to show enormous goodwill to the Republic of Ireland. We don't want to make decisions that make its economy less successful. But if we leave without a deal and impose the common external tariff against the Republic of Ireland, that is extremely damaging for the Irish economy. And the Irish government ought to understand the risk it is taking, and the EU likewise.
Thank you for that. It's an email question on a different matter. This comes from Dan in Leicester. Jacob Rees-Mogg is a very successful businessman. What's his view on the other big story in today's news, which is the merger of Sainsbury's and Asda? I'm sure if you're not fully aware of it, you're aware of some of the details of 15 billion. The concern here being that currently we have a big four, supposedly, then we have a big three. Does that help choice? Does that help the consumer? Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Well, it's a very important deal. The numbers 2 and 3 merging, they would be a very dominant player. I'm sure it will be referred to the Competition and Markets Authority, which happens to have a recently appointed new chairman in Andrew Tyree, who was chairman of the Treasury Select Committee when I was on it, who's an absolutely brilliant man. And I think bringing his really first-class brain to investigating this can ensure that the deal is looked at thoroughly and that competition is maintained, because the great thing about supermarkets is how competitive they are and how Lidl and Aldi have come in and have made the other supermarkets, the more established supermarkets, reduce their prices and up their game. And it's fascinating to watch how competitive this market is and how you see one become stronger and then face competition and another one rises up. And we want to ensure that there is real competition in that market.
Anthony in Kent, if Mrs May goes ahead with a customs partnership, what would Mr Rees-Mogg's position be?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. That I would not be supportive of a customs partnership, and it would depend whether this came to votes in the House of Commons. I don't think a customs partnership is going to happen, because the EU has said that it is opposed to it.
But if she stuck with it, could this be something that would get you mobilising the forces?
I'm not mobilising anything, no. This is not some sort of military action. We're supporting the Prime Minister in doing these very difficult negotiations. The custom plan has so many logical inconsistencies that it won't survive much further.
Is she aware of this?
I'm sure she is.
Why is she sticking with it then?
Well, because they're looking at a number of different options, and this is one of them. And sometimes you get into the sunk cost fallacy that you've done some work on something and you think if you do a little bit more work on it, you'll find that there is an answer within it, whereas actually it's very often better to start again and look at something new.
Last question for this edition is Sylvia in Selby, I think in Yorkshire. Sylvia, you're on the radio, go ahead.
Hello, Nick, and hello, Jacob.
Hello, Sylvia.
What I'd like to say to you, Jacob, is you've got marvellous qualities to be a leader of the Conservative Party, and how you are conducting yourself with Brexit, what the 17 million people that have voted to come out, you are a marvellous spokesman for Brexit. But what I've come on for is, when will the unveiling of the statue of Margaret Thatcher be unveiled in Parliament Square?
This is, of course, because we saw one to Millicent Fawcett, I think it was, the suffragist, last week, and now 11 plays 1 as regards men v women. Should it go 11 v 2? I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I'm first of all going to thank Sylvia for her very kind words, and particularly as today Yorkshire and Somerset are playing cricket at Taunton.
Are
so
they?
It's very nice to have such friendly words coming from Yorkshire when we're in the midst of a crucial match. But in terms of the statue of Margaret Thatcher, I'm sure one will be put up to her in Parliament Square within my lifetime. It's just a question of which statue and when. The first statue didn't get planning permission, but I'm sure there will be one. She is such a towering figure, the first woman Prime Minister, the most brilliant leader this country has had in recent times.
I have to say, most of our listeners know her better than they know Millicent Fawcett. Would she have been a better candidate for the first statue?
Do you know, I think Millicent Fawcett is a really important person, and that the suffragist movement did a great deal of important work in leading to votes for women. And no, I'm very pleased that Millicent Fawcett has been properly recognised. She's one of the unsung heroines of getting votes for women, partly because she did it by less aggressive means. And I think it's sometimes quite a good idea to remember the calmer elements within a campaign.
Before I let you go, did you see the story earlier this month? I'm sure you did, Mr. Rees-Mogg, that the use of emojis is ruining people's grasp of English. You know, these little slogans that goes on the end of text messages. I know you're a massive fan of the English language. Do you share those concerns?
Well, Mr. Ferrari, I am a fan of the English language, and I have never thought that serious-minded people use emojis.
So I've got a couple to see whether you'd identify them. This is them then.
I don't know.
So do you have any sense? This emoji is a top hat.
Yes, I
Now,
recognise
if I put that on the end of a message to you, Mr. Rees-Mogg, what do you suppose I'm saying?
You're saying that you're planning to go to Ascot.
Not bad. You want a night on the town.
Oh, okay.
You want a night on the town. Secondly, let's do this one. Here we are. There's a face with tears dropping out of either eye.
I have a feeling, because there seems to be quite a broad smile, that is somebody who is crying with happiness rather than in mourning.
He's not bad, is he? That means LOL.
Does it? Which we know from David Cameron means laugh out loud, not lots of laughs.
Yes, because...
And I do see that could cause confusion under certain circumstances.
This one, which is a monkey covering his eyes.
Oh, this must be the three wise monkeys: see no evil, hear no evil, say no evil.
It's near enough. It means embarrassed.
Okay.
Can I say you're too good at that? We thought we'd stump you. You did rather... I'm wondering, was it supposed to... Yeah, two dancing ladies?
Number 11 in bingo.
Going out on the town. Jacob Rees-Mogg, you did very well. I give you 75% out of that. I give you a very, an A-, and you're great. Jacob Rees-Mogg there, appearing on Ring Rees-Mogg. We welcome Mr. Rees-Mogg back in a couple of weeks. You're listening to LBC. Jacob, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Where News with Simon Conway is next.
Jacob Rees-Mogg has told LBC the issue of migrant removal targets is not Theresa May's responsibility, as she's no longer the Home Secretary. Her successor, Amber Rudd, has resigned, admitting she inadvertently misled MPs over whether the targets existed. Mr. Rees-Mogg insisted Ms Rudd has not been acting as a human shield for the Prime Minister. The chief executive of Sainsbury's has told LBC talks over a merger with Asda first began 2 years ago. The two supermarkets have agreed terms for the planned £12 billion tie-up. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator is beginning a 2-day visit to Ireland. Michel Barnier is meeting cross-border groups and companies to discuss the potential consequences of the UK's exit from the EU. LBC weather, very wet and windy across the east and southeast of England, where it'll feel cold. Elsewhere should stay largely dry with bright spells, a high of 12 degrees.
LBC travel, long delays continue in both directions on the North Circular Road to the Crooked Billet underpass. It's because of the flooding. One lane stays closed both ways, and there are delays all the way back to Edmonton and from the A12. Delays continue of about half an hour on the M25 clockwise from junction 29 at the A127 and over the QE2 bridge after an accident earlier, but all the lanes have been open for a while. Still very slow on the M25 clockwise up to junction 24 at Potters Bar, where those barrier repair works are still taking place, and delays on the A10 southbound from Ware to Hoddesdon because of a fuel spillage. On the train, southeastern and southern services remain disrupted because of the strong winds and heavy rain. That will be the case for the rest of the day.